friends, it's Gwen. One of the very first tools that I purchased as a beginner paper crafter were paper punches. I wasn't sure where to begin, but I knew they would be super versatile. Fast forward 20 years and I now have a bunch of them in my stash and loads of ways to use them. I've got a bunch of tips and tricks that will take your punches to the next level, and they're so simple that even with very little experience, you can get great results. Let me show you how. Starting with border punches. These are some of my favorite style of punches because they create a very decorative edge to any size piece of paper. They come in a huge range of sizes and shapes, so something like a simple scallop all the way up to a very ornate lace design. Let me show you how they work. This one is quite a big one, so it'll be nice and easy for you to see. There are some guidelines along that top edge, and that's so that you can center the paper. Super handy if you just want to do one punch. If you want to punch the entire edge of a paper, you have a couple of options. You can center it and start there, or you can line up your paper with the edge of the punch like I did here. Now, you'll also notice that as you punch, there's guidelines on the left and right hand side. You'll want to be sure to take the time to align it very carefully. I'm looking at the guide on the left here, but I'm also making sure that the edge of the paper is pressed hard up against the edge of the punch. That way, you'll get a super clean result. This next style of border punch is really great if you have a small craft room. They have a locking mechanism here on the bottom, and that locks the punch nice and flat. From there, you can stack them up, and there is a sticker on the side so you can see which design is which. So all the punches you've seen so far will do down one single side of a piece of paper. This is a very clever set that allows you to go around the square. So it includes a corner punch for the corners and then a matching border punch for the edges. Now there is a little bit of math involved, but everything is laid out for you in the instruction sheet. It does actually only work on certain sized pieces of paper, so you do have to follow the instructions. You'll start by cutting a square piece of paper. This one is 5 by 5, and then using the corner punch, you'll punch all 4 corners. This part of the process is exactly the same no matter what size you're working with. Next up though, we need to do the edges. To do those, we need to follow the markings on the punch. Now you might notice they're not the same markings that we used earlier when we were punching just down a single edge. We actually want to use the markings that are slightly closer to the center. Take the time to make sure that these are really well aligned and that the paper is pushed up against the edge of the punch. Take your time here because if you do, you'll end up with a really lovely result. You can then just work edge by edge all the way around the 4 sides. The measurements have all been done for you, so all you need to do is punch along each edge and you'll find everything lines up beautifully. These are all punches from my own personal stash, and if you check the description box below, I'll leave links to them wherever I can. From time to time, you may find a small piece of paper that's been missed. No problem, you can just trim that off with your scissors. These punches are really lovely to use on card bases as well as in scrapbooking. I use them as a frame for my layout, but also within the paper layers themselves. I do have a couple of layouts to share just so that you can see them all in action. This is one of my most favorite ways to use edge punches, and it's great if you have a bunch of paper strips that you want to use up. So all I've done is grabbed a bunch of paper scraps from within the same collection. It's easier to do it that way because you know the papers will go together. I've then punched along the edge to create these decorative strips, and then added them to the background of my layout. You can see here that I have added stitching as well, and to get the stitching you actually have to be a little bit patient because they have to be added one at a time. So you add the first paper strip and then you run it through your sewing machine, and then you add the next paper strip overlapping it ever so slightly. You then run that one through the machine and then go on to the next paper strip. So yes, it's a little bit time consuming and fiddly, but I really love this look. It's time for a quick tip, and did you know that you can keep your paper punches nice and sharp by punching them through aluminum foil? Go for a better quality foil and do this regularly to maintain your punch sharpness. Have you tried doing this? If you have, I'd love to know your results in the comments below. Next up, we have the basic punch family, but do not underestimate these ones because there's so much you can do with some punches in basic shapes. I have a bunch of these in my stash, and you might notice they come in a range of different styles and sizes. Consider the punch mechanism itself because some are better for frail hands than others. My number one tip for working with this style of punch is to use it upside down. You always want to be able to see where you're punching. So that one, the second one there, that would be the wrong way to use the punch. If you can't see where you're punching, you're going to end up wasting paper and you lose a lot of control over the design that ends up in that punched piece. There are a lot of times that you'll want to know exactly where you're going to be punching. Are you ready for another punch hack? Well, this one is great if you love the look of a scalloped edge, but you don't want to buy a scallop edge punch. You can DIY it with a basic heart punch. So all you'll need to do is grab a strip of pattern paper and then punch out your heart shapes. You don't even need the whole heart. You can actually punch just the top part. So maybe go halfway through the heart. Once you have a bunch of those, you'll want to line them up in a straight line. You could also use a T-square ruler to help. You can then grab a piece of pattern paper or cardstock and lay it over the top of them. I'm always mesmerized by this process because they do still look like hearts at this point, but the moment you put that cardstock over the top, they miraculously turn into perfect little scallops. This is a super inexpensive way to get the look of an edge punch. I have a couple of layouts to share. These are all using those basic punches. This one uses a square punch to create a background grid, perfect for paper scraps and leftover bits and pieces. I have just punched out a bunch of the squares in coordinating patterns and then lined them up on my background and adhered with some stitching. I've used the same technique on this layout right here, and in fact this page has 5 different types of punches on it. There is a full step-by-step tutorial to recreate it. I'll leave a link in the description box below. Here's another example. This layout uses a 2-inch circle punch. I stamped a bunch of background images onto some spare card and then punched those out as well as some pattern paper. I've mixed and matched them on my background for a really eclectic look. If you are just starting out with punches, I highly recommend that you get these basic shapes, so squares, circles, and heart shapes, because they're the ones that are super versatile. You really can use them in so many ways. Ready for another craft punch hack? This one turns a square punch into a rectangular one. The first thing you need to do is cut a paper strip that is the same width as your punch or slightly smaller. When you slide the paper into your punch, you'll want it to poke out the other end. You don't want it to go all the way through the punch. You want it to sort of go up and over that second part of the punch so it slides. You can then punch it to any length at all that you would like. Here's a super close-up look. Just be mindful that you'll need to guide the paper and make sure that it is straight as you punch. Here's another way you can use that same punch. This time I'm focusing on the outside edge of the punch. I only want to use 2 sides of the punch to punch, and I'm going to create a little flag. It may take you a little bit of practice at first, but once you get the knack of it, it's a super fast way to add flags to your little banner pieces. I'm going to combine those last two tips and show you how you can take a square punch and create really cute little banners. So I cut the banner end first, and that was just in case I needed a couple of goes at it. Then I can slide it up and through to whatever length I want. I told you there was a bunch of things you can do with these basic shapes. Next up, I want to talk about the negative part of the punch, so the bit that actually gets left behind. So I've cut a strip of pattern paper. I've then punched out a row of hearts and then trimmed that piece down. You can also do this technique with just a single heart and have that as an element on your layout. Let me show you what this looks like on a page. So for this layout, I've created a bit of a mixed media background with some acrylic paint. I've then used the punched out heart parts to show that background off. I love too that it just adds this layer of texture and interest into my paper layers. You can also layer a contrasting pattern paper underneath, and that's a really nice look as well. I've combined that here with the edge punches. I have another punch hack for you. Did you know you can use this style of punch as a stencil? Simply take some scrap paper and punch the punch out, but allow as much of a gap around the edge as possible. You can then use this piece in the same way that you would use any stencil. I'm going with Distress Oxide ink and a brush. Next up, we have flower punches. Now the format for these is exactly the same as the basic shapes. I did want to keep them separate though, because there are some different things you can do with these elements. Once you get a collection of these, you'll find the flower components layer up really lovely. I've also used the very small flowers almost in the same way as I would an enamel dot. They're a really lovely finishing detail to a layout. There are 3 different sized florals in this one, and they've actually all been punched out of the very same pattern paper. I have then laid them down as a background for my layout. I've just mixed and matched the sizes and spread them out onto the background for the page. The next group of punches are super practical. The first is a single hole punch. These are great for punching the tops of tags. You can even use the leftover bits as flower centers. The next punch is a reinforcer punch. This is great if you're using paper and you want to reinforce it if it's going into a ring binder. And this last punch is used in the memory decks. You can take any pattern paper you like and turn it into a memory decks card with this one. Next up, we have punch boards, and these things are magic. They do so many things. They're super clever. This one creates envelopes in lots and lots of different sizes, and the second one there is actually brand new to my stash. That one makes pockets. The thing I love the most about these boards is that they are an all-in-one solution. So it's a punch, you get the scoring tool as well as a bone folder. Let's make an envelope. All of the measurements are provided on the board, so we need to start by cutting our paper. I'm going with 8 by 8 inches. The board also tells us where we need to have our first punch. I'm going to line the paper up at 3 1/8. I'm going to punch and then score. With that done, I don't need to look at the ruler anymore. It's only ever used for that very first score. I've rotated the paper and I'm lining up the score line with the score guide. I punch again and score another line, and then I'll rotate the paper again. The big mistake that people make when using this punch board is overusing the ruler. That ruler is only there for your very first score. So as you rotate your paper around, you'll end up with 4 notches that have been punched out and the 4 score lines. It's now time to fold your envelope up. Oh yes, and the punch board does come with a corner rounder. It's actually quite clever because it's on the opposite side of the punch that creates the notches. You can actually create very pretty envelopes, especially when you use double-sided pattern paper. I'm going to glue all that down and then create some crisp edges with my bone folder. Here's a look at the finished envelope, and I did also want to show you a sample layout. The pocket on this page is actually part of an ephemera pack from the collection, but I want to be able to make these in all different sizes and shapes, and I'm going to be using punch boards to do it. I love the idea of being able to add these in my paper layers and having a spot to hide journaling. Up next, I have a very versatile punch. This one is called a tab punch. You might have actually come across a punch like this in an office as part of a filing system, but I'm going to use it on a scrapbook layout. I have a couple of layout samples to share with you. They both use the same idea of pairing this tab punch with some washi tape. The first thing you'll want to do is place down a strip of washi tape. You can then take your tab punch and punch it out. Don't worry if the washi tape isn't quite wide enough for the tab punch. This still works. Obviously, it does work better with the wider tapes, but in both of the examples that I'm sharing today, it's that skinny washi that I've used. I have punched out a bunch of the tabs with the washi attached, and for this layout I actually did it in two different prints. I alternated those prints as I attached the rows to the background. You'll want to stack the tabs a little bit like bricks, so they will be staggered, and I feel like that really adds to the texture and the interest of this technique. I've also stitched them down in the same way that I did with the edge punches right at the start of the video. Another favourite punch of mine are butterfly punches. Remember, this is the punch that was featured in the stenciling technique that I shared earlier. Butterflies and floral clusters go together like salt and pepper, so if you like to create pretty pages, you need to add to your stash of butterfly punches. I think it's time for another punch hack, and this idea is another use for those basic shapes that you've been collecting. These are really great to layer up to create your own little mini embellishments. You can also use them layered to recreate the look of a cut file. I'm going to share two examples of that right here for you, but if you're after a full step-by-step tutorial that you can follow along with, I have those on the channel. I'll leave links in the description box below. If you found this video super helpful, be sure to subscribe to see more just like it. In this first example, I've used a basic square punch but laid it on the diagonal to recreate a diagonal background cut file. On this second layout, I'm layering up my punches. I have a circle and then that same butterfly punch that I love layered on top. I've placed them on the background of the layout to replicate this circular cut file. I have a couple more punch hacks to share with you. The first one solves a big problem. If you've ever tried using up paper scraps, sometimes you'll find that the piece that you want to use up is very hard to position within your punch. Not a problem, just grab a thin strip of scrap paper, add a little bit of adhesive, and you can create your very own handle. This idea was a game changer for me because it enabled me to use up all of those little bits and pieces of leftover pattern paper. I know you have them in your stash and now you know what to do with them. So you now have all the tips and tricks you need to get started, right? Well, maybe not entirely. Tips and tricks are one thing, but it can be really helpful to see a full step-by-step tutorial. If you want to put these ideas into action, you need to watch this video next. It's time to pull out your paper punches and come create with me. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, bye!